Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a mist-laden October morning that the case of the veiled harpist first came to our attention. The fog clung to the streets like a mourner's shroud, and even within the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the fire crackled not for warmth but for defiance against the prevailing gloom. Holmes sat at his usual place by the window, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze distant and unblinking. I had just set aside the Lancet, having failed to find in its pages anything more stimulating than a rather dry discourse on gout. There are certain mornings when the very air seems to presage some curious development, and on this day I felt it keenly. The atmosphere in our lodgings was hushed, as though in expectation. Holmes, who could be as talkative as he was silent, had spoken not a word since breakfast. He merely watched the shifting fog, his sharp features rendered almost spectral in the pale light. "You observe, Watson," he said at last, "how even the city itself seems reluctant to unveil its secrets today, an appropriate veil perhaps for what may come." Before I could inquire further, the quiet knock of a visitor interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson's soft footfalls preceded the opening of the door. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her brows drawn slightly in concern. "He seems unwell." As the young man stepped inside, his face pale beneath a dishevelled shock of auburn hair, I could not help but feel that the morning's oppressive weight had been but a herald for something darker still. The fog outside had crept in, not through the windows, but in the eyes and trembling voice of the man who now stood before us. The gentleman gave his name as Mr. Harold Pike, a violinist by profession, and though he was decently dressed, there was an unmistakable nervousness about him that bespoke more than the usual discomfort of addressing Sherlock Holmes. His fingers twitched as though still caught in the rhythm of an unfinished piece, and his eyes darted from Holmes to myself and back again, as if uncertain where to begin. I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice a shade too thin, "but I come on behalf of Lady Adelia Forrester, if indeed that is still her name." Holmes raised a single eyebrow, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Please, Mr. Pike, sit. Begin at the beginning. You may speak freely." Pike sank into the chair, clasping his hands tightly. "Lady Adelia is a recluse. You may have heard her name, though perhaps not recently. She was once the toast of London's concert halls, an unmatched harpist, renowned not only for her skill, but for the mystery she wove around herself. 20 years ago, she vanished from public life. Since then, she has lived alone at Wessex Manor, playing only for a private circle of trusted guests. And yet," Holmes murmured, "you have come, not with praise, but fear." Pike nodded. "In recent months, Lady Adelia has grown strange. She insists she hears music when no one is playing. She claims the harp speaks to her in tones only she can hear. Last week, she fainted in the middle of a recital and awoke screaming that she had seen death in the mirror of sound. She will no longer allow anyone to look upon her face. Her veil is constant, even in solitude." He paused, then added in a whisper, "She believes someone is trying to kill her, Mr. Holmes. And I—" The words caught in his throat, but Holmes's sharp eyes had already narrowed. "You believe it too?" he said softly, or you would not be here. Holmes leaned back, fingers now drumming lightly upon the arm of his chair. Death in the mirror of sound, he repeated thoughtfully. A curious phrase, poetic even. Tell me, Mr. Pike, has her health been otherwise stable? Pike hesitated. Physically, yes, but she has grown thinner, more withdrawn. She refuses food on some days, and the music she plays, it has changed. Dissonant, erratic. It unsettles the servants. Does she compose? Rarely. Mostly she plays from memory or fragments of old scores, but of late I have found sheet music in her hand I do not recognize, unfinished bars, half phrases, then scratched out with fury. Does she live alone? She is attended by an old housekeeper, Mrs. Radley. There is also Reverend Markbridge, who visits often. And then there is Lucian Gale, her student. He studies composition, though I find his presence somewhat unsettling. He is intense. Holmes stood and walked to the window. Tell me of the veil. Pike's gaze darkened. She has worn it in public since her disappearance from the concert world. At first, it was part of her mystique. Lady Adelia, the veiled harpist. But now she wears it even alone. She says the veil protects her from being seen by things that lurk in the corners of the room. At first, I thought it eccentricity. Now I fear it is fear itself. There was a silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. I received a letter yesterday, Pike continued, unsigned. It warned me not to seek help, that if I involved anyone, especially the one who plays with minds, Lady Adelia would not live to see another sunset. He reached into his coat and produced the folded paper. Holmes took it gently, reading the words in silence. Then he passed it to me. It appears, Watson, Holmes said, with a curious glint in his eye, that music is not the only art being practiced at Wessex Manor. There is also theatre, and we are about to be drawn into the final act. No sooner had Mr. Pike departed, his thin frame vanishing once more into the greyness of the London afternoon, than Holmes returned to his armchair with the air of a man settling into a familiar puzzle. He lit his pipe with care, each motion deliberate, as though every flicker of flame might illuminate a hidden truth. It is the kind of case, Watson, he mused, that emerges only rarely, layered not merely in mystery, but in performance. A veiled musician, a phantom melody, and now a warning unsigned. We are being summoned, though not by the client. I had just begun to pen down the essential facts in my notebook when the knock came, sharp, deliberate, and entirely unlike the timid rapping of Mr. Pike. Mrs. Hudson reappeared moments later with an envelope balanced upon a silver tray. "It was slid beneath the door, sir," she said quietly. "No messenger in sight." Holmes opened the envelope with a practiced flick. Inside, a single sheet bore just one line in bold, angular hand. "Leave the harpist to her fate." There was no signature, no address, not even a seal. The paper smelled faintly of camphor and something bitter beneath it. Perhaps ink hastily dried or something more curious. Holmes studied the note in silence for several moments before handing it to me. "An amateur's attempt at intimidation," he said at last, though his tone carried an edge of interest. "Note the spacing, deliberate, but inconsistent. The writer was afraid enough to threaten." "And what will you do?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "I shall do what one always must when the curtain rises unexpectedly, Watson. I shall attend the performance. There is truth hidden behind this veil, and I intend to lift it." Our journey to Wessex Manor was marked by an increasing silence, both external and internal. Holmes, usually so animated when engaged by a puzzle, had withdrawn into himself, speaking only to mutter the occasional observation on railway timetables or the peculiar dialect of a station master. I did not press him. When he was in this state, wholly absorbed by the stirrings of his mind, it was best to let the thoughts unfold of their own accord. We arrived at the manor late in the afternoon, the autumn sun sinking behind a jagged line of trees. Wessex Manor stood aloof upon a rise, its stone face stern and weather-worn. Though the house had not been left to decay, there was an unmistakable air of neglect about it, an untended ivy here, a shutter askew there. It had the feel of a place forgotten not by time, but by intention. We were met at the door by a woman of severe countenance, who introduced herself as Mrs. Radley, the housekeeper. She led us through halls dimly lit and sparsely adorned. The silence that enveloped us was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, something left unspoken. Holmes took in every detail as we passed, the slight fraying of the stair carpet, the absence of portraits on the wall, the curious echo of our footsteps, sharper than they ought to have been. He remarked quietly that the acoustics of the place were unusually sharp, an observation I thought trivial at the time. "She will see you shortly," Mrs. Radley said, her voice flat. "The lady is resting." Holmes turned to me then with a whisper. "Observe, Watson, the hush of this house is not that of peace, but of fear. Even the walls seem reluctant to speak. I wonder, when she does appear, what music the harpist's silence will carry with it." We were shown to a drawing room where the heavy curtains had been drawn against the dying light. The air within was thick with a faint perfume, sweet yet curiously dry, as though it had not been refreshed in some time. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to chase away the sense of stillness that clung to the chamber. It was some minutes before she entered. Lady Adelia Forrester moved with a grace that had not yet abandoned her, though her frame was thinner than I would have expected. Her movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. She was dressed entirely in black, her face hidden beneath a veil of fine dark lace that fell from the brim of a small antique hat. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft and tremulous, "and Dr. Watson, I thank you for coming." Holmes inclined his head but did not speak. He studied her with that peculiar intensity which, in most men, would border upon rudeness. Lady Adelia, for her part, seemed neither surprised nor offended. Her hands, I noticed, were gloved, and they trembled slightly as she motioned for us to be seated. "I have been a prisoner of silence," she continued, her words strained. "And yet, even in silence, I have not found peace. I have heard music where there should be none, footsteps in the corridors when all are asleep. The harp speaks to me in ways no human tongue can. I fear," she faltered. "You fear?" Holmes prompted gently. "I fear that something seeks to drive me mad, or worse, to hasten my end." There was a pause. Holmes spoke at last. "Your veil, Lady Adelia. You wear it not merely for mystique, I think, but for protection. Protection from what?" She turned her veiled face toward the fire. "From being seen," she whispered. "Not by you, Mr. Holmes, not by anyone living, but by that which hides just beyond the veil of sound." I confess a chill passed through me. Holmes, however, only nodded slowly, as though the final piece of a prelude had been struck. "The performance begins," he murmured, "and already the notes are discordant." Following our first meeting with Lady Adelia, we were invited to dine with the remaining members of the household. It was a curious affair, sparse in both fare and conversation, held in a room whose silence seemed only partially relieved by the clatter of cutlery. Holmes remained unusually quiet, though I could sense his attention flitting with precision between each of the faces around the table. First, there was Mrs. Radley, the housekeeper, a woman of rigid bearing and thin lips, whose manner suggested a devotion less born of affection than of long habit and control. She answered questions curtly, and when Holmes inquired as to the number of staff employed at the manor, she replied, "Those necessary to keep the house from falling in, Mr. Holmes. No more, no less." Then came Reverend Mark Bridge, a tall, bony man with the anxious eyes of one who sought devils in every shadow. His collar sat askew upon his neck, and he had the curious habit of rubbing his fingers together beneath the table. He claimed to visit Lady Adelia for spiritual counsel, but his glances toward her were furtive, almost fearful. Lastly, there was Lucian Gale, the music student, a man in his late 20s with dark, restless eyes and the slender fingers of a pianist. He spoke little, but observed much, and I fancied he looked at Holmes with a quiet wariness, as though aware that his own secrets were but a question away from exposure. "There is a heaviness in this house, Holmes," I remarked to him privately afterward. "It is like sitting in a theatre where all the actors have forgotten their lines, and no one dares to leave the stage." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, Watson, and yet each believes he plays the leading role." He leaned forward. "Three individuals, each cloaked in restraint. The housekeeper conceals authority behind duty. The clergyman masks guilt in piety. And the pupil, there's the key. He listens, Watson, but not to the harp. He listens to the silences." As we retired for the evening, I could not shake the sensation that Wessex Manor held more than just secrets. It held hostages. And we, now lodged within its walls, had joined their number. That night, at Holmes's suggestion, we attended what was announced as a small recital in the music room. A tradition, Mrs. Radley informed us, that Lady Adelia maintained every Friday evening, though of late it had become more ritual than pleasure. The room itself was circular, with high ceilings and strange acoustics that rendered even the softest footstep unnaturally sharp. The harp stood at the centre, a grand and beautiful instrument of dark wood and golden fittings, its presence almost ecclesiastical. Lady Adelia entered last, veiled as always, and seated herself before the harp with slow, deliberate grace. Holmes stood a pace behind me, his eyes fixed not upon the lady, but upon the instrument. She began to play. The music at first was hauntingly beautiful, soft minor chords, delicate arpeggios, phrases that evoked forgotten gardens and lost youth. But then, a strange discord crept in, a harshness, subtle but jarring like a blade hidden in velvet. I felt a shiver pass through me. Holmes leaned closer. "Watch the fourth string of the bass register, Watson. The tension is not correct." Before I could respond, there came a sharp twang, a note struck with too much force, and Lady Adelia gave a cry, her hand recoiling. A moment later, she collapsed forward against the harp, the music dying in a single resonant chord. We rushed forward. I reached her first and found her breathing shallow, her pulse erratic. There was no sign of blood, no visible wound. Holmes was already examining the harp. He crouched beside it, lifting one of the lower strings delicately with his handkerchief. "As I thought," he murmured. "The string has been tampered with, wound more tightly than the rest. Had she struck it with more force, it might have snapped clean across her throat." "And the collapse?" I asked, still supporting her limp frame. He touched the wooden frame with a gloved finger, then brought it to his nose. "Brushed with a contact agent, temporary but powerful, not designed to kill, merely to disorient and frighten." Lady Adelia stirred faintly. Her lips moved, but her voice was a whisper. "He's here," she murmured. "He's listening." Holmes straightened. "Yes," he said softly. "And tonight he has heard enough." Lady Adelia was carried from the music room by Mrs. Radley and Reverend Markbridge, the latter offering scripture under his breath that sounded more like a ward against sorcery than prayer. I remained close by her side, examining her pulse, which had steadied somewhat, though her skin remained clammy and her breath shallow. Holmes, however, lingered beside the harp, utterly absorbed. "You believe she was poisoned?" I asked once we were alone. Holmes did not turn. "No, Watson. Not poisoned in the common sense. Drugged, yes, but not lethally. The substance used here is of a class designed not to kill, but to disorient. Observe." He removed a small glass vial from his coat and moistened a cloth. Gently, he rubbed it across the carved ridge just beneath the strings. Within seconds, a faint yellowish hue appeared against the wood. "An alkaloid compound," he said. "Non-lethal in this quantity, but applied precisely where one's fingers might rest during play. Absorbed through the skin. The effect is brief confusion, lightheadedness, and muscular weakness, enough to cause a collapse. Its purpose is not harm. It is terror." I stared at the instrument, struck by how elegantly the attack had been orchestrated. "So this was no accident?" "Indeed not," Holmes replied, straightening. "What we witnessed tonight was theatre, Watson. But unlike most performances, the audience was not the object, it was the victim, and every note, every string, was part of a carefully constructed deception." He glanced toward the corridor down which Lady Adelia had been taken. "Our veiled harpist is not losing her mind. She is being made to doubt it. Someone is manipulating her perceptions, feeding her fear." "But for what end?" Holmes folded his arms. "To destabilize her, isolate her, and eventually destroy her reputation, if not her life. This is not the act of a madman, Watson. It is the work of an intellect both cruel and deliberate." I felt a chill pass through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Holmes looked at me then, and I saw that expression I'd come to know well, the one he wore just before the game began in earnest. "The ghost in this house," he said quietly, "has no need of chains. Music is his weapon, and madness his stage." It was shortly after the unsettling events of the recital that Holmes, with characteristic precision, turned his full attention to the history of Lady Adelia Forrester. While she rested under the care of Mrs. Radley and the ever-pious Reverend Markbridge, Holmes disappeared for the greater part of the day, leaving me at the manor to continue quiet observation. He returned near dusk, his coat marked with the light dust of travel, and his expression bearing that familiar gleam of silent satisfaction that meant he had uncovered something significant. "Well, Watson," he said as we stood together on the manor's west terrace, overlooking the overgrown gardens below. "The past, as always, casts the longest shadows." He drew from his coat a small portfolio of newspaper clippings and parish records. Lady Adelia was not an only child, as our client's account might suggest. She had a twin sister, Miss Honora Forrester. "A twin?" I repeated, startled. "Indeed, a fact that has been conveniently excised from the family's present narrative. 20 years ago, during a summer retreat here at the manor, Miss Honora vanished. The official account was accidental drowning, but no body was recovered." I took the papers from him and perused them quickly. There was mention of a boating incident, a disputed time of disappearance, and curious inconsistencies in the testimony of the few staff then employed. Holmes continued, There were whispers, of course, talk of rivalry between the sisters, of an argument overheard near the lake, but no charges were brought, no inquest held. The affair was quietly buried, both literally and figuratively. And Lady Adelia, I asked. What was her state at the time? There are reports of a prolonged collapse. She ceased all public performances. She dismissed most of the staff. Then, a year later, she re-emerged in London society, still veiled, still haunted, and bearing the same name. But if Honora's body was never recovered... Holmes raised a finger. Precisely. One twin vanished, and the other returned cloaked in grief and mystery. But who returned, Watson? Who? A shiver passed through me. You do not believe. I believe, Holmes said quietly, that the dead may not rest when the living have borrowed their names, and that such a deception, if real, is not merely a matter of disguise. It is a theatre of guilt, performed daily beneath a veil. He turned his gaze toward the darkened lake below, its surface glass-like beneath the rising moon. I suspect, he murmured, that more than music haunts these waters. That evening I found myself alone in the library with Mrs. Radley. Holmes had taken to the gardens once more, pacing with the slow, deliberate steps that signified intense inner calculation. I, having little talent for deductive solitude, sought instead the warmth of conversation. Though warmth was not a quality I associated with the housekeeper. She sat stiffly by the hearth, her hands clasped in her lap like a penitent in confession. After several moments of strained civility, I ventured a question that had lingered in my mind. Mrs. Radley, has anything unusual occurred within the house of late? Beyond Lady Adelia's illness, I mean. She looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether truth was worth the price of speech. Then she said, in a low voice, music, when no one is playing. Harp music, soft, distant. At first, I thought it imagination. Then I began finding the sheet music. Altered. Altered, I asked. Pages left askew, some torn. And once, the notes rearranged into a melody I did not recognize, a strange minor progression that left me unsettled. She hesitated, then added, Twice, I have heard the harp when the room was empty and locked. I felt an involuntary chill and leaned forward. Has Lady Adelia spoken of it? She says she hears it constantly, not with her ears, but within her bones. Mrs. Radley's voice faltered. She believes it is her sister. I froze. Her sister? She looked away. I should not have spoken. Please. But the damage was done. The atmosphere of the manor, already thick with gloom, had taken on a new layer of unease. The image of a harp playing in an empty room, of ghostly melodies drifting through locked corridors, lodged itself in my mind with stubborn tenacity. When Holmes returned, I relayed what she had told me. He listened without interruption, then said quietly, The mind, Watson, can be tuned like an instrument, and someone in this house is striking just the right chords. It was on the following morning that Holmes, under the pretext of inspecting the tuning of the harp, contrived to remain behind in the music room, while I was encouraged to accompany Lucienne Gale on a brief walk through the East Garden. Whether by design or coincidence, the conversation that followed proved curiously illuminating. Lucienne walked with a slow, methodical step, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze seldom meeting mine. For a man trained in music, his silences were not restful, but taut, as if each unspoken word was a note held just beyond its resolution. She was not always like this, he said at last. Lady Adelia, I mean. There was a time when she played not from memory, nor from sorrow, but from joy. There was laughter in her music, Doctor. Watson. You have known her long then? He hesitated. 10 years. First as a student, then as something else. I glanced at him, noting the colour that rose to his cheeks. You love her. His mouth twitched, half a smile, half a grimace. I did. I do. But one cannot love a shadow, and that is what she's become. A veiled ghost, wandering the corridors of her own life. And she? Does she return your affection? At this his eyes grew hard. She fears it, or perhaps not it, but what it might unearth. You see, affection demands truth, and Lady Adelia has long lived without that burden. There was a moment of silence. She is not mad, Doctor. Watson, he added, more to himself than to me. But something haunts her, something she cannot name, and I have seen enough to know that music is not the only thing being composed within these walls. He turned then, his face a mask once more, and we said no more until we returned to the house. I relayed the conversation to Holmes later that evening. He listened with his eyes closed, fingers pressed together. There is honesty in the confession, he murmured, but whether it is the confession of a witness or a participant, we have yet to learn. That same evening, as the hour drew near to midnight, I found Holmes once more on the move. He beckoned for silence, and we made our way through a side door leading to the gardens, guided only by the weak gleam of the moon. A shadow was seen moving among the hedges, he whispered. Pike mentioned it to Mrs. Radley. It seems we are not the only ones who walk this house after dark. The night air was cool, scented with damp earth and autumn decay. We passed under arches of withered rose vines and paused near a thicket bordering the lake. Holmes crouched suddenly, motioning for me to stay behind. There, amid the shrubs, something shifted. A dark figure, quick and silent, moved toward the outer edge of the garden. Holmes gave chase with a burst of speed I had not expected from him at that hour, and I followed, breathless. But before we could close the distance, the figure vanished into the trees beyond the estate fence, leaving only broken twigs and disturbed leaves in its wake. Holmes halted by a stone bench and knelt, retrieving something from the ground, a scorched scrap of paper. He studied it intently before passing it to me. It was the torn half of a photograph, partially burnt at the corners. 2 women stood side by side, one smiling gently, the other with eyes cast downward. But what drew the breath from my lungs was the violent stroke of ink that had scratched out the face of one entirely. The past, Holmes murmured, has an unfortunate habit of surviving its own burial. I stared at the image. Are they Adelia and Honora, or perhaps Honora and Adelia? Twins, inseparable, until someone sought to erase the other. But who would keep such a thing, and why burn it? Because even memories, Holmes said, can become dangerous when they refuse to remain silent. Someone, likely the same person responsible for the recent torments, wished to destroy the evidence, but part of it survived. He folded the photograph with care. We are closer now, Watson, not to solving the crime, but to understanding its roots. There is something in this house, unspoken, unseen, that binds its inhabitants, and it began not with a poison or a trap, but with a betrayal. In the days that followed, the oppressive atmosphere of Wessex Manor grew almost unbearable. The house seemed to shift around us, doors that closed on their own, faint footsteps where none walked, and above all, the harp's mournful voice drifting through corridors no hand had touched. More than once, I found myself roused from uneasy sleep by distant chords that dissolved into silence the moment I rose to investigate. I could not help but feel that we were caught in the grip of something beyond reason. The haunting, the unnatural music, the withered expressions of the staff, all suggested a malign force rooted in something more ancient than mere criminality. I confessed as much to Holmes one morning as we stood in the upper gallery, the manor hushed in its usual tension. "You believe in ghosts now, Watson?" he asked, not unkindly. "I believe," I replied, "that this house is sick, and that its disease cannot be explained through science alone." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then allow me to offer you a diagnosis." He led me to the music room. "Stand here," he said, placing me in the far corner. "Now speak in a whisper." I did so, and to my astonishment the sound was amplified and cast across the room with unnatural clarity. "The curvature of the ceiling," Holmes explained. "An architectural peculiarity. It distorts and reflects sound in ways the ear does not at once perceive. A whisper here becomes a phantom voice elsewhere." He pointed to a tall mirror on the opposite wall. "And that? It is angled slightly. Not enough to notice, but just so that one sees movement where none exists." I turned to him, the pieces falling into place. So the footsteps, the whispers, even the appearances. Mechanics of fear, Watson. Illusions carefully engineered to push Lady Adelia to the brink of madness. But to what end? Holmes's eyes darkened. To isolate her, discredit her, and ultimately remove her, not through murder alone, but through erasure. As we turned to leave the room, he added in a low voice, "It is not spirits that haunt this manor, Watson. It is deception, and we are but one step from discovering whose hands guide it." It was the next evening when the illusion gave way to something more violent. Lady Adelia, by Holmes's encouragement, had agreed to rehearse once more in the music room. She appeared subdued, her motions stiff, as though afraid the harp itself might strike back. Holmes and I lingered in the hallway beyond, listening in silence. Then came the sound, a sharp creak, a splintering groan, and in the blink of an eye, a great crash. We rushed into the room to find the crystal chandelier, once suspended high above, shattered upon the floor where Lady Adelia had stood only moments before. She had recoiled just in time, the hem of her gown torn, her breath coming in terrified gasps. Holmes surveyed the ceiling with narrowed eyes. "Cut deliberately," he murmured, pointing to the severed chain. "A calculated attempt, precise timing. This is no longer mischief, it is a campaign." I moved to calm the lady, who clutched at me with trembling hands. "It was not an accident," she whispered. "He is coming closer. I feel it." Holmes knelt beside the wreckage. "Indeed," he said softly. "Closer and bolder." That night, he locked himself in the study and pored over his notes in silence. At last, just before dawn, he emerged with a single sheet of music in his hand and a look of grim determination in his eyes. "It is time, Watson," he said. "The final act approaches, and the stage must be set with care." It was Holmes who suggested the recital, a final performance, framed as Lady Adelia's farewell to music and to society. It was, in every outward sense, a sentimental gesture. But I knew my friend too well to be misled by appearances. The gathering he arranged was not merely an audience. It was a theatre in which each player would reveal his role, willingly or otherwise. The household assembled in the music room just after sunset. The atmosphere was taut with something more than anticipation. Lucien Gale stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his brow furrowed with something I could not decipher. Reverend Markbridge muttered into his collar, hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Radley, as ever, was unreadable. Lady Adelia entered last, her figure even more frail than before, though still cloaked in that impenetrable veil. She nodded once to Holmes, who gave no indication of acknowledgement, but instead moved to stand near the tall mirror at the rear of the room, his chosen vantage, I suspected, for more than mere observation. Without introduction, the lady took her seat before the harp. What followed was perhaps the most sombre and disquieting performance I have ever witnessed. The music was sparse, almost fragmented, each note like a breath held too long. I could not help but feel as though we were not hearing a recital, but a confession spoken in a language we were never meant to understand. Holmes remained utterly still, his gaze flicking not toward Lady Adelia, but to the faces of those watching her. At times, I saw him make a subtle mark in the small notebook he had tucked into his sleeve. Then, as the final melody began to rise, Holmes moved a step forward. "Watch closely now, Watson," he murmured, though I could scarcely hear him above the tension that clung to every note. There was a sense of nearing resolution, of a crescendo not merely in music, but in the mystery itself. The room was a stage, and Holmes, though silent, had already begun to draw the curtain. It happened in an instant. The music, already wavering in its tone, suddenly faltered. Lady Adelia's gloved hands froze upon the strings, her back arched as though struck by some unseen force, and she gave a low cry, a sound not of pain but of utter surrender, before crumpling forward against the harp. Chairs scraped. Mrs. Radley shrieked. Lucien Gale sprang forward, but it was Holmes who remained perfectly still, his eyes not on the fallen figure, but on the faces of those around her. I knelt beside the lady, feeling for her pulse. It was there, faint, fluttering, but she was insensible. "She is alive," I said quickly, "but barely conscious." Holmes made no move to assist. Instead, he drew a small envelope from his coat and calmly stepped to the centre of the room. "This, I believe, is the moment," he said, voice cool, "in which illusion yields to truth." There was a hush. "Lady Adelia has played her last note," he continued, "and with it we arrive not at an end, but at a beginning. For the music we have heard this evening was not a farewell, it was a summons." He turned toward Reverend Markbridge. "You were watching her hands. Why? Afraid she would falter, or that she would reveal something you hoped buried." The clergyman stammered, but said nothing. Holmes turned to Lucien. "And you, Mr. Gale, you did not move until she collapsed, but your fingers—" "Ah, your fingers twitched with anticipation from the first note. You knew what was coming." Lucien's jaw tightened. Holmes nodded slowly, as if confirming some silent deduction. Then, for the first time, his gaze turned to the veiled woman, now lying motionless beside the harp. "There is a truth," he said quietly, "hidden behind veils, mirrors, and names. But tonight, Watson, tonight, we begin to lift them." The room had fallen into that peculiar silence which often follows catastrophe, tense, uncertain, and humming with restrained dread. Lady Adelia still lay motionless beside the harp, and yet Holmes did not call for aid, nor did he seem troubled by her condition. Rather, he turned to the assembled household with the calm finality of a man who has reached the end of a very long calculation. "You have all seen a collapse," he began, "but what you are about to see is a revelation, and for some in this room it may prove as jarring as any fall." He moved to the fallen woman, knelt, and with a gentleness I had not expected, lifted her veil. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The face beneath was pale, drawn, and altogether unfamiliar. Similar to Lady Adelia, yes, but not identical. The resemblance was uncanny, yet the distinction was undeniable. Holmes stood and addressed them all. The woman you see before you is not Lady Adelia Forrester. She is her sister, Honora Forrester, presumed dead these 20 years. Mrs. Radley covered her mouth with a gloved hand. Reverend Markbridge took an unsteady step backward. Lucian remained frozen. She did not die in the lake, Holmes continued. There was no accident, only a bitter quarrel by the water's edge, and a decision made in haste and grief. The real Adelia drowned, and Honora, either consumed by guilt or seized by opportunity, assumed her identity. He gestured to the photograph we had recovered from the garden. 2 sisters, one face erased, one life stolen. She vanished for a year, I murmured, recalling the timeline Holmes had earlier pieced together. Indeed, said Holmes, a necessary transformation. The veil, of course, was never fashion, but disguise. The music room, her stage, and you, the players in a drama of deception. At that moment, the woman stirred. She blinked up at us, dazed but no longer hiding. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and low. I buried her, she whispered. I did not kill her, but I let her drown. No one spoke. Holmes regarded her with something akin to pity, though his tone remained steady. And for 2 decades, you have worn her name like mourning cloth, but now the charade ends. It was not cruelty that marked his words, but closure. The curtain had lifted, the mask had been removed, and from beneath it, the truth, faded, broken, but unmistakable, had emerged at last. For a moment no one dared move. The woman, Honora, now laid bare in both name and face, closed her eyes as though willing herself elsewhere. But Holmes's attention had shifted. He turned slowly toward the man who had remained stillest of all. Lucian Gale, he said. Or shall I call you by your proper name? Lucian Hartley. The young man's eyes flickered. Yes, Holmes went on, I know. Your parentage was a puzzle until recently. But the answers, as always, were in the details. In the composition you left in Lady Adelia's room, written in a key unique to your late father's own style. Charles Hartley, composer, libertine, and briefly, the companion of the real Adelia Forrester. Lucienne said nothing. You are his son. Illegitimate, yes, but legitimate in one regard, your desire for vengeance. You believed Adelia ruined your mother, and when you discovered she had drowned. She didn't drown, Lucienne snapped. She escaped. She stole a life that wasn't hers. And in doing so, Holmes said, she provided you the very stage you required. You played upon her guilt as surely as she played upon those strings. You whispered through walls. You tampered with the harp. You arranged every illusion not for art, but for destruction. Lucian's hands were trembling now, not from fear, but rage held barely in check. Holmes went on. You made her believe she was haunted. You made us all believe it, and had tonight proceeded uninterrupted. I dare say you would have arranged one final, fatal performance. I felt a terrible clarity descend upon the room. Lucienne's expression changed then, something between defiance and despair. She deserved to remember, he said. She deserved to be exposed. Holmes inclined his head. And now she has been. But it is not for you to play judge and executioner, Mr. Hartley. He turned to me. Watson, stay near. He will not go quietly. And indeed, he did not. What followed occurred in less than a minute, and yet it lives in my memory as one of the most charged moments I have ever witnessed at Holmes's side. Lucian Hartley, eyes wild with fury, lunged, not for Holmes, but for Honora. I moved to intercept, but he was swift. Holmes, however, was swifter. With a movement as fluid as it was final, he stepped between them, catching the younger man's wrist and twisting it backward in a manner I had seen him employ only once before. In a tavern brawl many years prior, Lucian howled and struggled, but I caught his other arm, and together we brought him to the floor. It took the strength of us both to restrain him. Mrs. Radley cried out. Reverend Markbridge began to pray aloud, his voice trembling. Honora said nothing. When at last Lucien ceased to fight, Holmes leaned close to him and said, not unkindly, "You are clever, Mr. Hartley, but cleverness divorced from conscience leads only to ruin. I shall ensure Scotland Yard knows both your brilliance and your bitterness." We left him in the custody of the local constable, summoned quietly an hour later. Holmes made no flourish of victory, nor did he speak again of justice. Instead, we returned to the music room, now empty, save for the shattered remains of the harp. Its strings lay scattered like broken threads across the floor. Holmes stood before it in silence. "It is strange, Watson," he said at last, "how an instrument of beauty, when misused, may become a weapon, just as a name, just as a memory." He picked up a single splinter of wood and held it between his fingers. "And yet," he added, "when broken, even music cannot lie." In the hours following Lucien Hartley's arrest, the house settled into a strange quiet, not one of peace, but of emotional exhaustion. The veil had been lifted, both figuratively and literally, and yet the full measure of what had transpired still hung in the air, like the final chord of a sonata that had not quite resolved. Holmes, as ever, wasted no time in providing resolution. He gathered the remaining members of the household in the parlour, the broken harp cordoned off behind a curtain. There, with his usual composure, he began to unravel the final strands of the mystery. "What you have all witnessed," he said, "has not been a single crime, but a composition of layered deceits, each note designed to resonate with fear, guilt, and silence." He turned toward Mrs. Radley. "You, madam, were the first to know. You saw the change when Honora returned a year after her sister's death. You said nothing, but you knew." She looked away, her face unreadable. "To sustain a deception of this nature," Holmes continued, "required more than secrecy. It required control. And so the veil became not only a disguise, but a defense, a shield between the impostor and the world, yes, but also between herself and the truth." He moved to the writing desk and produced the anonymous note which had first reached us in Baker Street. This, you will note, bears a handwriting that matches a discarded composition in Mr. Gale's quarters, written in haste, but betraying the same angular slant and pressure. Lucien Hartley sought revenge, but his approach was theatrical, fitting perhaps, given the nature of his adversary. Holmes turned his gaze upon Honora, who sat silently, her eyes hollow but unafraid. "You were not mad, Miss Forrester," he said gently, "but you were made to believe you were. The tampered harp, the distant music, the moving mirrors, all devices designed to fracture your grasp on reality. But that would not have been possible without the original deception, the theft of identity, the assumption of a life that was not yours to wear." At this, she flinched, though she did not speak. Holmes concluded, the tragedy did not begin with sabotage. It began years ago, by the lake, and from that moment, everything else, Lucien's vengeance, your retreat, the ghost of the Harpist, was but the echo of a single, fateful silence. He said no more. There was nothing more to say. The household sat in stillness. the spell of illusion broken, the performer unmasked, and as I looked at her, no longer veiled, but no less mysterious, I thought to myself that few masks are as complete as the ones worn not for disguise, but for survival. It was the following morning when I found her there, Honora Forrester, standing alone by the lake where 2 decades prior, her sister's life had ended and her own had been stolen. The mist hung low over the water, and the reeds whispered in the breeze like mourners unwilling to speak aloud. I approached quietly, uncertain whether I was intruding. She did not turn. "I suppose," she said softly, "this is where it must end." There was no tremor in her voice, only the kind of stillness one finds after a long illness, when even grief has grown tired. "She slipped," she continued. "That much is true, but only after I said something cruel, something unforgivable. I told her the world would never accept her music, that she would always live in my shadow." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost inaudible. We argued. Words turned bitter. She turned from me, and as she did, her foot caught the stone. I could have reached her. I saw her fall, and I did nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. "I sat there for hours," she whispered, "and then I made a choice. I returned as her. No one knew. We had always been interchangeable to others, except in music. I took her veil, her name, and her silence, and I tried to live inside it. I said nothing. What comfort could I offer?" She looked out over the water. "I thought I could bury it, that if I played her music long enough, I might forget the key to my own. But the notes always betrayed me. Each one a reminder. Each one a lie." She turned to me then. "Do you think Holmes knows what it is to carry a secret like this?" I shook my head. "Number. But he understands what secrets can do." She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod and walked back toward the house, the hem of her gown brushing the dewy grass like a final bow drawn across the strings. And I remained by the lake, listening not to the wind or the water, but to the silence that followed. A silence that, for the first time, felt honest. Later that day, Holmes and I retired once more to the study that had served as our headquarters within Wessex Manor. He sat beside the fireplace, his long fingers steepled, his gaze distant but precise. A man who, though the case was solved, had not yet laid it fully to rest. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "what we mistook for haunting was, in fact, performance, albeit one of a darker composition." He rose and began to pace slowly. Lucienne Hartley did not simply wish to frighten Honora Forrester. That would have been too crude, too uncertain. No, his was a carefully orchestrated sequence, engineered to exploit her guilt, her isolation, and most critically, her need to remain unseen. He gestured to the ceiling. The strange acoustics of the music room allowed him to transmit whispers and musical fragments with uncanny clarity, redirected sound that appeared to emanate from nowhere. He tampered with the strings, altered the tuning, and introduced subtle disharmonies that would appear only under certain conditions. The result was not madness, but disorientation, a ghost in the sound itself. "And the mirror?" I asked. "Tilted by fractions," Holmes replied, "but with precision. Enough to suggest movement in the periphery of vision, a shadow in the corner of one's eye. Combine this with carefully timed appearances, a fabricated letter or two, and a few late-night encounters, and you have a spectre born not of the supernatural, but of the subconscious." I nodded slowly, recalling my own unease. He played her like an instrument. Holmes's face darkened. Exactly. And the most tragic irony is that Honora, who once assumed another's life to escape grief, became captive to a theatre of that very grief, rehearsed, reimagined, and turned against her. He sat again, speaking more softly now. Lucien Hartley composed no symphony, Watson, but he was an artist nonetheless. A cruel artist, one who understood how to turn guilt into echo, memory into weapon. His notes were shadows, his rhythm, fear. The fire crackled behind us, and I could not help but feel we had peered not only into a crime, but into the anatomy of a soul dismantled. As I sat by the window that evening, overlooking the windswept grounds of Wessex Manor, my thoughts turned not to Lucien Hartley, nor even to Honora Forrester, but to the strange interplay between art and truth, how each may conceal or reveal depending on the performer's intent. Honora's deception had not been motivated by greed, nor even survival in the simplest sense. It was something more complicated, more human, a sorrow that wished not to destroy the past, but to rewrite it. She had taken her sister's name not to triumph over her, but to preserve her, to live the life lost by accident or fate, and in doing so to bury her guilt within the fragile confines of music. But deception, even when born of mourning, is still a fracture. It alters the shape of memory, and the longer one lives within it, the harder it becomes to remember where the lie ends and the self begins. Holmes, of course, had seen this. He had seen through the veil, not with emotion, but with clarity. Yet even he, I believe, harboured no scorn for the woman whose crime had been silence. Lucien, on the other hand, had turned that silence into a stage. His was not a grief misunderstood, but a grievance nurtured. He transformed art into artifice, empathy into manipulation. And in doing so, he blurred the line not between life and death, but between remembrance and revenge. It struck me then how fragile the human mind can be when caught between music and memory, how a single unresolved chord can echo for years, warping perception, deepening regret. Wessex Manor had been a concert hall of ghosts, not of spirits, but of identities misremembered, misused, and mourned. And in its final silence there was no applause, only understanding. Our last evening at Wessex Manor was one of stillness. The household had dispersed, the case concluded, and the weight of revelation now settled like a final curtain. Holmes had spoken little since supper, retreating to the parlour with his violin in hand, a ritual I had long since learned to respect in silence. He played for nearly half an hour, soft, slow strokes of the bow, no clear melody, but rather a sequence of tones that seemed to reach backwards, grasping at something too distant to hold. It was neither joyful nor mournful. It was perhaps the closest I had heard him come to expressing sorrow. When he set the violin down at last, I turned to him and asked quietly, "Was it justice, Holmes?" He did not look at me when he answered, "No, Watson, not justice, but perhaps equilibrium, a balancing of tones in a dissonant arrangement." He stood, gathering his coat and gloves. "There are crimes," he continued, "that the law cannot cleanly name, and griefs that no deduction can resolve. But at the very least, truth, when spoken aloud, can end the music of madness." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "Even music, Watson, when shrouded in lies, can become an instrument of death." And with that, we left Wessex Manor behind, the last faint echoes of Holmes's violin still lingering, like the memory of a note that fades, but is never quite forgotten. As the train pulled away from Wessex, Holmes sat across from me in our compartment, eyes half closed, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The countryside blurred past the window, but his mind, I knew, was focused inward. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever considered how often deception is born not from malice, but from mourning?" I looked up. In this case, certainly, Honora's crime was not murder, it was erasure of herself. Of the past, he nodded slowly. Precisely. Most criminals seek to gain. But here we found one who only wished to vanish, while another, denied legacy, sought to make the dead speak through fear and illusion. There was a pause, then Holmes added, almost as an afterthought, "Grief and guilt, my dear Watson, are twin instruments. When played by the wrong hands, they produce the most dissonant music of all. But here is where the case leaves us with one final riddle. What do you think was Lucien Hartley's greatest mistake? Was it underestimating Holmes, revealing his father's signature in the music, or believing that revenge could rewrite a mother's disgrace? We would be most curious to hear your thoughts. If this tale stirred your imagination or gave you pause, be sure to share your theory in the comments below. For more cases from the fog-filled alleys of Baker Street, subscribe to join us in uncovering the next mystery. And if you know someone who would appreciate a story where music, memory, and identity collide, share this tale with them. After all, the game, as ever, is afoot.